The portrait flattered her, and this allowed Anne to become the Queen of England, if only for a few months. Henry VIII was repulsed by the Flemish mare. Never had a ruler felt such disappointment from his own choice. He had wanted to marry a charming young enchantress, not this colorless German. Nevertheless, Anne was satisfied with her position. At least she managed to keep her head, unlike another queen who shared her name. In the household of the Duke of Cleves, children were not burdened with much education. At the court in Dusseldorf, the only knowledge required was at the level of a modern first grader, reading in their native language and writing their name. Singing and dancing? Heaven forbid. French? Why complicate things? The girls had modest amusements. Each season, they were given a piece of fabric to diligently work on their embroidery. Needlework was encouraged. Gradually, the Duke began to arrange marriages for his 3 daughters. The second eldest, Anne, was promised to Francois of Lorraine. At that time, the betrothed were just 12 and 10 years old, and of course, the wedding would have to wait. Years passed, political interests changed, and the engagement lost its relevance. Another party could not pick up, so Anne of Cleves remained a maiden until 1540th year. At that time, England was once again without a queen. The king successively elevated Catherine of Aragon and Boleyn and Jane Seymour to the throne. The last one managed to fulfill her duty to the country by giving the king an heir, but she soon passed away. And although Henry now had a son, Edward, having 1 or 2 more princes would be extremely desirable, just in case. Of course, any favorite could make Henry happy, but a child born out of wedlock would be considered illegitimate, and bastards, as is well known, have no rights to the throne. That's why the Tudor needed a son from a legitimate wife. But where could he find one if the king was already on his 4th wife? And neighboring rulers were reluctant to marry off their beloved daughters to Bluebeard. The search for a bride threatened to drag on. The king himself did not want to see any Spaniards. Relations with the French were strained, and English women raised suspicion. The king had already witnessed how the Boleyns and Seymours were vying for power. So who was worthy of wearing the crown? An English ambassador in Brussels mentioned that the Duke of Cleves had 2 daughters of suitable age. King Henry sent his representatives to the German lands. What followed was almost comedic. The princesses were dressed in luxurious gowns, their hair hidden under elaborate headdresses, and they appeared at an evening reception in dim lighting. In short, it was difficult to truly see them. Flattering letters flew to London. "Lady, Anne is delightful." The king smiled. Hans Holbein was commissioned to paint a portrait of the girl, and in this artwork, the artist clearly enhanced Anne of Cleves. Henry gave his approval, and preparations for the wedding could begin. The marriage contract was signed, and soon the princess set off for England with her entourage, reaching Calais in December. Admiral Southampton promptly reported to the king, "The princess is exceptionally lovely." Word of her beauty had preceded and igniting the king's imagination. Finally, the day arrived when the bride and groom met face to face. The king was taken aback, not by the beauty of his betrothed, but quite the opposite. Flemish mare was his verdict. The most unfortunate part was that it was already too late to back out of the wedding, so the ceremony proceeded as planned. The morning after the wedding, the king coolly announced that he had not even touched his wife, and found herself in a precarious situation. On one hand, she tried to live like a true English queen, learning the language and assembling a court of noble ladies. On the other hand, Henry consistently displayed his alienation. The unwanted wife felt threatened, especially when, a few months later, she was sent away from London. What Anne didn't know was that a replacement had already been found, young Catherine Howard. Henry's messenger informed Anne of Cleves that the king desired a divorce, expressing no grievances against her, and was willing to recognize her as a beloved sister, providing her with financial support. For the inconvenience caused, Anne was guaranteed £4,000 annually, plus estates. For a girl from a small duchy, this was more than a generous offer. Anne agreed, and the divorce was finalized in July. The Flemish mare quickly became a kind relative. The relationship between the king and Anne of Cleves turned tender in a familial way. The former queen held an esteemed position at court and got along well with her husband's children. There was no reason for her to mourn. The young woman had access to a substantial sum of money and lived in a splendid estate. Until the king's death, her financial support remained unchanged, and she was not prevented from remarrying. However, Anne chose not to take advantage of this offer. Her one unsuccessful marriage had dampened her desire to try again. When Anne of Cleves passed away, she made sure to mention her loyal servants and friends in her will. As was fitting for a queen of England, her remains were interred in Westminster Abbey. But who is to blame for the overestimation of Anne's appearance? The ambassador in Brussels? The king's trusted advisors, who were supposed to get a good look at her during the reception at the Duke of Cleves' court? Probably a bit of everyone. They had been given the green light to find a wife for Henry VIII, and they did their best. They knew full well that the king was in a hurry and would be upset by any delays. That's why Anne of Cleves ended up on the English throne, and among all the Tudor wives, she was perhaps the luckiest of them all.